Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today's video is going to be me taking a slight break from talking about the What's Next series that I've been doing, and instead I'm going to talk about the NBA draft lottery that was last night, and I'm probably going to cover it for a video tomorrow as well. And today I just wanted to talk about just the huge impact that this draft lottery has on the NBA moving forward, on a handful of different teams, and I'm just going to go up and down throughout the lottery and talk about some teams that I find really interesting what happened to them last night in the lottery. But before I get to specific teams, I think it's important to look at what this means for the NBA overall, because obviously this is the first year that the league has used these new lottery odds. They wanted to try and deter some teams from tanking, from intentionally trying to be bad. And that's really the first point that I see here, and that's that maybe they actually succeeded. Maybe this is maybe not the end of tanking, but it's not going to be as big a part of team building moving forward, because as we know, it's very common in the NBA for teams to intentionally try and be bad to get a high draft pick so that then moving forward they can go and be really good all of a sudden. And it's something that has kind of, trickled into other sports leagues, but it's mostly been an NBA issue. And by flattening out the lottery odds, by making it harder for really bad teams to guarantee themselves a really high pick, they wanted to try and deter teams from tanking. And maybe this lottery will end up doing that moving forward, because only one team that was absolutely awful this past season ended up with a top 4 pick in this draft, and that was the Knicks. And then obviously the Pelicans, Grizzlies, and Lakers, who were all either 7 or lower, ended up with the other 3 spots in the top 4. So that's going to be something interesting to look at moving forward. I don't want to be too much of a prisoner of the moment and say that this is just some gigantic deal, 1 year into these new lottery odds, but I think teams are going to look at this pretty heavily and say, is tanking still worth it? Or maybe even putting bigger and bigger protections on their first round picks if they do end up trading them away. So those are some things to keep an eye on moving forward. But now we're going to move on to talking about some individual teams, and obviously we're going to start with the team that ended up winning the draft lottery, and that was the New Orleans Pelicans. And they're probably going to, they're 100% going to end up taking Zion Williamson with the first overall pick, and this is obviously a big deal for a number of reasons. One, the fact that New Orleans ends up with Zion Williamson is huge for them moving forward, no matter what they do with Anthony Davis in terms of trading him, not trading him. Zion Williamson is a huge piece for them. Whether he wants to be there or not, they're going to have the right to draft him. And then obviously no other team has that trade piece to try and dangle in front of them to get Anthony Davis. It was reported before the lottery that if the Knicks did end up with the first overall pick, that was something that they planned on using as a trade piece in an Anthony Davis trade. And even though Woj kind of went against that report right before the lottery, that's still obviously a big trade piece that's not out there for other teams to try and get Anthony Davis, because the Pelicans have it themselves. And later on, when I talk about teams like the Lakers and Knicks and Celtics, I will discuss kind of how the lottery impacted their Anthony Davis trade packages. But for this team moving forward, I still would anticipate that Anthony Davis is going to be traded. Reportedly, the draft lottery did not change his mind on wanting to or not wanting to be in New Orleans. And I don't think the hope of a rookie is really going to be something, even a rookie as good as Zion Williamson, is going to be something that's going to sway him away from wanting to leave New Orleans. I would anticipate they're still going to trade him because he is still a free agent next off season. But when you start out with Zion Williamson and then whatever the return is going to be from Boston or New York or LA or some other mystery team for Anthony Davis, this Pelicans team has a great foundation moving forward and will definitely be a team to watch. Next up now is the Memphis Grizzlies, and this is a team that I find it kind of interesting that nobody's really talking about, because obviously the big deal is Zion Williamson probably going to be playing in New Orleans, potentially with Anthony Davis. But the Grizzlies situation is really, really interesting, because most people think that Ja Morant is the second best player in this draft class, and then RJ Barrett is right there with him. And the draft really starts at number 2 now, because we all know what's going to happen at number 1. And really there's 2 different paths that the Grizzlies could take here. Either they go with RJ Barrett and they try and be good moving forward. They keep Mike Conley on the roster. They roll with Barrett and Jaren Jackson Jr. and some of the other role players that they have and try and be good next year. Or they pick Ja Morant and either trade Mike Conley for value and kind of go into a rebuilding mode more so than they are right now. Or they draft Ja Morant and then have Mike Conley stick around and try and mentor him as their point guard of the future. And there's even more layers to this, because the Grizzlies owe the Celtics their pick next year if it's outside of the top 6. And then if they keep it in the top 6, then the Celtics get the Memphis pick unprotected in 2021. So they can't just full on rebuild So there's a lot of layers here in terms of who they're going to go with at number 2 that the draft lottery obviously had a huge impact on, because they went from being projected to be 8 all the way up to number 2. Number 3 now is the New York Knicks, and obviously their fans were really anticipating getting the chance to draft Zion Williamson, and that's not going to happen for them anymore. But ironically, even though obviously, they're disappointed that they didn't end up with the number 1 overall pick or the second pick and they ended up at 3, they did the best out of all the teams that had the worst records in the league in terms of maintaining their spot in the top 4. I would imagine that this is probably going to be a piece that they're still going to try and dangle in front of the Pelicans as an Anthony Davis trade piece, because the way that they're looking at it, they can say, hey, you can have John Morant or RJ Barrett in addition to Zion plus some of our young guys in exchange for Anthony Davis. And based off what Woj said on air right before the draft lottery started, it didn't seem like the Knicks were all that interested in trading the first overall pick for Anthony Davis anyway, so maybe technically they're more likely to trade for AD now, and obviously they have one of the better packages out there for him, so that will be interesting to keep an eye on. But also keep in mind that the Knicks ideally wouldn't trade for Anthony Davis until after free agency. They use up their cap space, and then they go and trade for Anthony Davis, with whoever they draft with the 3rd overall pick obviously being a huge part of the trade package. Moving on to number 4 now, this is obviously a big one. The LA Lakers somehow ending up with the 4th overall pick in this draft, and this was certainly strange because they didn't have very good odds at all of getting a top 4 pick. And as I was watching the draft lottery unfold, I was watching it with a buddy, and I was just kind of watching, the picks being revealed, and I was like, oh, the Lakers aren't 11, they're not 10, they're not 9. This is getting really interesting. And then I didn't even notice it. My buddy pointed out that they were revealing who was in the top 4 as they were revealing the other picks, and the Lakers came up, and I was like, I didn't even notice that that was even a possibility, because I was like, okay, maybe they'll move up from like 11 to 7. But somehow they got the correct ping pong balls to fall their way. And this is huge for them. I cannot overstate how big of a deal it is for their pick to go from being projected to be like 11 all the way up to 4, whether that's as a trade piece for Anthony Davis, because they're definitely going to need that pick if they want to get Anthony Davis, because the value of some of their trade pieces, specifically Brandon Ingram, has certainly decreased over the last few months, as I talked about in their What's Next video here pretty recently, or just if they use the pick to try and surround LeBron and the young guys with better players moving forward. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this stroke of luck impacts not only their ability to get Anthony Davis, but also maybe free agents. And then just moving forward, how this, just random ping pong balls falling their way could affect NBA history completely, which is kind of what tomorrow's video is going to be about. At 5, 6, and 7 now, these are 3 of the worst teams in the league record-wise last season that are victims of the new draft lottery odds. The Cavs, the Suns, and the Bulls all fell down about as far as they possibly could at 5, 6, and 7. And so they're really bad teams. They didn't win very many games, and they're going to end up with middle lottery pick players in this draft class, which is a really, really interesting repercussion of these new odds. Again, I'm going to talk about that in a video tomorrow, but that's obviously not great for those fan bases. There's not really a whole lot else to talk about here unless you're talking about players that they're going to draft specifically, which I'll get to as the draft gets closer. But obviously, really, really big deal that these teams did not get a higher pick than they did, when in other years, typically, they would have. Next up now is a team that actually has 2 top 10 picks in this draft. The Atlanta Hawks ended up at 8 and 10, 10 being Dallas's pick that had actually a relatively good chance of landing in the top 4 and Dallas retaining the pick, but it ended up at 10. And then the Hawks' own pick ended up at 8, and they actually dropped significantly as well, along with some of the teams I talked about right before them. So it kind of sucks that they ended up at 8, but you can't really feel bad for a team that has 2 top 10 picks in this draft. And now we're going to clearly understand what the Mavs ended up giving up to get Luka Doncic, because the trade from last year's draft is now going to read Luka Doncic in exchange for Trae Young and the 10th pick in this draft, whoever that ends up becoming. And it's definitely, it's not going to be like a huge star caliber player off the bat. It's definitely going to be a more flawed prospect and a guy that's going to need a lot of development, but could be a huge part of this Hawks core moving forward, as could the 8th pick. And I wouldn't be shocked if they tried to move up with those 2 top 10 picks and maybe try and get a more star caliber player. But either way, it's good for them to have 2 top 10 picks, even though the 8th pick certainly could have been higher than it ended up being. And overall, in what was the most anticipated draft lottery in a long, long time, because of the new odds, because of Zion, because of the Anthony Davis situation, this did not disappoint. From an entertainment standpoint, this was an outstanding draft lottery. I don't even remember the last time that I was completely invested in the lottery, but the new odds definitely changed things for me. I was a lot more interested. There was a lot more protections going on. This was the perfect storm for the NBA when they introduced the new lottery odds. A lot of teams moved up and down. There was just so many storylines going on around the lottery just to make it one more event on the calendar for fans to be fully invested in, which is what the league has been great at over the last handful of seasons. And I think this is going to be something that we're going to look back on and say that maybe this was a huge turning point for like 5 or 6 different teams, whether it was the fact that the Mavs didn't end up with their pick, that the Grizzlies got to keep theirs and moved all the way up to 2, obviously the Pelicans ending up with Zion Williamson. And I don't want to step on tomorrow's video too much, but maybe you could make the case that the lottery and luck essentially is playing a bit too much of a role in team building and in how the future and the history of the NBA is going to be read moving forward. There are certainly teams that could have benefited from going up in this draft more than they did, and that is going to be something I think people are going to continue to analyze, the impact of this very first draft lottery with the new odds on how things go from here. But either way, like I said, extremely entertaining, and I look forward to covering it once again in tomorrow's video. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.